So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the seventh Satadru Sen Memorial Lecture. We've got to seven, which is remarkable, and it is all because of Professor Korubi Sen, Satadru's mother, who has endowed this lecture graciously, which has allowed us to bring speakers from far and wide, except during COVID when we were all restricted to the cloud. So Satadru Sen passed away untimely in the year 2018. And since then, we've tried to keep his memory alive, both as a scholar and also he was a very dear friend of mine. He was a historian of colonialism and the colonial period in South Asia and a fierce anti-colonial by temperament. He taught at Queen's College, City University of New York at the time of his passing. And much of his work is a kind of eerily prescient, in many senses, reminiscent of what is going on right now in the world, the genocide in Palestine. He was the author of pioneering works on the Andaman Islands, thinking about the idea of the primitive, the subhuman, the non-human, which is foundational to the violence of the modern and of colonialism. He worked on incarceration and the incarcerative regime across the Indian Ocean and the penal regime that was central to colonial rule, the trapping in of people within limited spaces so as to deny them not only of liberty, but also of a certain imaginative escape. But apart from this, he also wrote beautifully on cricket. He has a biography of Ranjit Singh. He also, cricket, as we know, is the national pastime in India, apart from writing the civil services examinations. Around 500,000 people write for 500 posts. So the rate of attrition is phenomenal and unbelievable. He also wrote on childhood and its invention in colonial Bengal. Much was invented in colonial Bengal. Childhood, too, I believe, was invented in colonial Bengal. That was Satadru's claim, a beautiful book. But apart from all of this, he was a dear friend and a contrarian with whom I argued and exchanged witticisms on Facebook. Well, at least I thought what I was saying was witticisms, and on Facebook before I finally met him. As with Priya, who I got to know on Facebook before I actually met her in person. And we carried on a conversation that had begun. And so when we finally met in New York, it was like we'd been talking forever. We just took off from where we had stopped on Facebook. One such conversation happened as we were both loved jazz and the blues. And so this conversation happened on the A train between Manhattan and Brooklyn, where we disagreed the entire length of the journey, 31 miles. We disagreed on whether Binoy Sarkar, the early Bengali sociologist, was a fascist or not. Now, this kind of debate, as you know, can go on till the cows come home. And 31 miles down, there was no resolution, and we argued our way back. And I said petulantly, if you know so much, then write a book. And so he did. So he wrote a book for one of the finest studies of Binoy Kumar Sarkar, which we published in a series that I edit for Rutledge, and which moved away from the cliches that surround him. Now, as to whether Binoy Sarkar was a fascist or not, the book, I don't think, gets into that very much. It's a bit like that essay by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? And no one knows whether the subaltern can speak or not. The answer is probably maybe. So maybe Binoy Sarkar was a fascist. We've had several speakers before Priya. We began the series with Vijay Prashad, the political commentator, Marxist historian. The last speaker was Sunil Amrit from Yale, who spoke on environment and the Anthropocene. And today we have Professor Priya Satia, who teaches at Stanford, whose works engage with empire and violence in the making of the modern world. Her most recent book, Time's Monster, thinks about history as a handmaiden of empire, history as a function of bad conscience, as it were. Why do good people do evil, and how do they justify that to themselves? So her book, the first book, well, not the first book, the book that brought her to the attention of the historical profession was really Empire of Guns, written in 2018, which again was on the theme of empire and violence in the making of the modern world. And it began by reflecting on the Industrial Revolution, and we have all of these propositions as to why the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain and why it was successful, coal supplies, the inventiveness, the tremendous inventiveness of the British, as self-defined, questions of empire, questions of slavery, questions of the Protestant ethic, which was one of the earlier formulations by Tawney, But in Priya's book, War is the Stimulant, and the government demand for military equipment actually underwrote the Industrial Revolution. So the work, Empire of Guns, was largely on the Birmingham gun-making industry and the relation between guns, land, property, and the central figure who appears towards the end is Samuel Galton, who's a Quaker, notwithstanding which he was a gun maker and who refused to give it up. So this is the paradox on which the book is based, and which is not really presented as a contradiction to us. There's something continuous between this, and that is really the argument that the book makes. In Times Monster, which was written in 2020 at the time of COVID, which appeared at the time of COVID, so I was able to read that and the 2 volumes of Piketty, all because I had nothing else to do. Now, I read your book out of interest, just to put it out there. And it really spoke about the evil of empire needing an assuaging of conscience so that the British could take part as liberals in the modern world. So history provided an alternative system of ethics, as it were. History was a narrative that allowed for the contradictions of liberalism. Samuel Galton, he was arraigned in 1790, the figure we have encountered earlier. He was arraigned in 1790. He was asked to explain how his specific religious commitments squared with his being one of the biggest suppliers of weapons. He argued that this is the historical moment. We were placed here by Providence. We had no choice but to participate in the war economy. So there was a kind of necessitarianism, so to speak. And that's how he squared his being a Quaker and a gunmaker at the same time. And there was a general appeal to the philosophical authority of the historical discipline, and the book takes up several figures in the course of the work. There's a close study in her other book, 2008, which appeared earlier, which was called Spies in Arabia, and it was about Britain's covert empire in the Middle East. Now, this is an interesting book because Priya reveals in an article on the internet that the greatest influence on her thinking and on her being has been Indiana Jones. So as a result of which she... Yeah, come on, don't spoil the story. And so she learned how to fly the Cessna. So if in case you want to go off on an adventure, she'll fly you to distant parts of the globe. And the book Spies in Arabia, again, deals with the question of empire and violence. And the idea of the Middle East being cast by the British colonial discourse as an empty space, right, occupied by people who didn't really matter, who didn't matter on the civilizational hierarchy. It's a very familiar story again in the present. And she says that in a close study of the aerial bombing of the rebellious Arabs in the 1920s and the 30s, experts claiming oracular insight into the region insisted that aerial control was the best midwife of the region's historical progress. This, as we know, was an idea that was taken up by Samuel Huntington much later during the Vietnam War, that the Vietnamese had to be bombed into modernity, right? And in a land that was trapped in biblical, medieval, mythical time, its modern reinvention had to happen through a destruction wrecked from heaven. Right? So again, I mean, much of Priya's work allows us to understand some of the processes that we see unfolding before us, processes that are unchecked. Long ago, Satadru used to write a blog, which is called Dash blog, which is still there on the net for those of you who are interested. And in June 2018, he has a short passage in a larger essay, which is dealing with the question of colonialism, violence, and so on. And the short passage goes, in her follow-up to her work on totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt described forgiveness as a central aspect of freedom. It is, she suggested, an act that disrupts the causality of offense and retaliation and thus makes human initiative possible. But again, after such knowledge, what forgiveness? And today's talk is about reparations. It is about human agency. It is about the possibility of forgiveness. It is about the possibility of taking, again, human agency into hand. The question of reparations, as we know, has been discussed. Ashil isn't here today, but This has been on our minds in Africa and Asia for a while. There have been demands for apologies. Shashi Tharoor, in a famous debate, Shashi Tharoor, member of parliament from India, in a famous debate at the Oxford Union, said that the British must pay £1 per annum annually as an apology, as a symbolic apology. There has been the return of art objects. There are some who insisted that it is impossible to have reparations because Utsa Patnaik, in a calculation, argued that $45 trillion were robbed from India between 1765 to 1938, taking export surplus earnings as a measure. So what do we do? How do we actually handle this question of reparation? What constitutes true reparations? Is it apology? Is it the return of art objects? Or is it just the fact, as A. Shivanandan wrote in London, we are here because you were there, right? The very presence of migrants all over Europe, that Johnny Pitts wrote a book recently called Afropian, speaking about the huge number of Africans who are there, not as illegal migrants, only 8% are illegal migrants. They're there as migrants. Is that the way in which reparations are going to happen? Through sheer presence. And I'll end with this anecdote. Ai Weiwei, the famous Chinese artist, at the Castle exhibition, he staged intervention, as it were. He flew in 1,000 Chinese into the small city, and the burghers of Castle woke up the next morning and the city was flooded with Chinese people, which caused considerable alarm. And in some sense, that is the kind of reparation that we're seeing happening beside all these debates that we are happening on reparations. But over to you, Priya, for your reflections on the question of reparations. Thank you so much for being here.
Sorry? Slide. Yeah. You can select the slide. While Fatima is setting up the slides, I just want to say thank you very much to Professor Dilip Menon for inviting me for this honor to give this lecture. And to Professor Korobi Sen, thank you so much for making it possible. This is my second day here, my first time in the country, and it's been just a wonderful 2 days. It's nice to get away from the States right now. All right, okay. Okay, so I just advance with these arrows. Oh, how will I advance this slide? No, okay. All right, okay. So, you know, as Dilip was mentioning, there's this growing literature. Can you all hear me? Okay. There's a growing literature on different aspects of reparations and the history of the demand for reparations in law and philosophy and history and so on. Today, I want to talk about the British backlash against reparations in terms of the shift in consciousness that anti-colonial thinkers who first, expressed this hope for reparations. The other thing they talked about was this shift in consciousness, which they thought of as necessary for decolonization, as necessary as reparations. And what they meant by that was a shift in values that was needed in order for any kind of monetary reparations to become even thinkable for British society. But a shift in values that would at the same time render an accurate calculation of the actual value of such monetary reparations totally unnecessary, okay? And hopefully that complicated sentence will make more sense as we go. So I'm going to start with the example of India, but we'll cover some other topics as we go. So in India, colonialism changed rights to land. It caused famine. It turned artisans and communal farmers and pastoral peoples into peasants and laborers, including coerced laborers producing things like indigo and opium and other global commodities. It's not just that poor Indians didn't gain much or that they were exploited by colonialism, but that so many ordinary people became poor and landless and thus vulnerable to neglect and exploitation, including as indentured laborers on plantations all over the empire. Britons paid for Indian goods with taxes that they collected in India from Indians, and then they sold those goods, they resold those goods elsewhere in the world at a profit. This was another form of exploitation. Britain appropriated Indian export income, and India borrowed from Britain to finance its imports, which put the entire Indian population in deeper debt to their colonial masters. Indian taxes also funded British wars and the creation of settlement colonies like Australia. Now, Indians, while this was going on, recognized the upheaval and the drain of wealth going on. Even British officials recognized it at times. So for one example, in 1840, the statistician and East India Company official Montgomery Martin estimated that Britain had deprived India of 724 million pounds between 1803 and 1833, and he remarked, quote, "Such a drain, even on England, would soon impoverish her." Indians rebelled and demanded reparation too. In his 1906 presidential address, oh, there's an echo. Is that okay? Somebody should mute on the Zoom. It's gone now. It's fine. Okay. So in his 1906 presidential address to the Indian National Congress, for instance, Dadabhai Nauroji, who I will show you his picture in his book. Yeah. He called for British reparation. That's the word he used. He called for reparation for India's past sufferings. He's already saying this in 1906. In the 1920s, Indians supported debt repudiation as their government's loans were funding British military and infrastructure expenses and heavy interest payments on previous loans that had been taken out for similar purposes. But besides such financial reparations, Indian anti-colonialism also called for repair at the level of the self. Yeah, can't see the slides. Oh, they can't see the slides. Okay. Indians' enmity was not with the English, Gandhi said, but with the English way of measuring civilization in material terms and the consequent tolerance for what they called necessary evils, like war, for instance, and greed, on the promise of the future positive material impact of such necessary evils. And this is what I talk about in my book, Time's Monster. Now, such values were, Gandhi said at the time in the 1920s, incompatible with planetary habitation. He warned, if a nation of 300 million like India adopted the economically exploitative industrialism of the West, quote, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Freedom was thus not about replacing white rulers with brown rulers, according to Gandhi, but about moral recovery from those kinds of materialistic colonial values. This is why, besides boycotts and strikes, the Gandhian movement was also about reforming education, changing values that way, and engaging in everyday practices that were aimed at redeeming the mind and the soul. For instance, walking, singing, fasting, spinning. So I'll just, that worked? Okay. Gandhians opened themselves up to deprivation, to violent punishment, to imprisonment and death. The purpose of all this was to try to awaken the suppressed humanity of their oppressors also. So recover their own and that of their oppressors. As Faisal Devji puts it, Gandhian non-cooperation was, quote, motivated by love for the opponent's humanity, no matter how residual it might have become. The idea was that nonviolence was an end in and of itself. It was not a means to some other political end. Whatever its effect in terms of changing political reality, it was in itself an assertion of self-rule, based on an understanding of freedom as the freedom to be an ethical being. And this is, which is what, Gandhi felt that colonialism was smothering that capacity. And this is still a very current definition of freedom. If you've read Leah Upi's book, Free, she's a philosopher at LSE, and she sort of defines it the same way. These ideas were not uniquely Gandhian. Gandhi was inspired by Tolstoy's call for the, quote, regeneration of the inner man. And he named his ashram here, as you know, Tolstoy Farm. Other contemporaries, such as the Indian philosopher-poet Muhammad Iqbal, also argued that man's purpose is to remake oneself ethically, not to remake the world, but to remake himself. Leaders of the Indian movement to preserve the Ottoman Caliphate after World War I similarly understood the experience of the common effort towards freedom as the experience of freedom itself. So there's no separation of ends and means. In the era of decolonization, Frantz Fanon, the Martinican psychiatrist who joined Algeria's struggle for independence, also insisted that the transfer of power was not enough because indigenous elites tended to preserve the power structures that had been spawned by the colonizers and then spent most of their time and energy just warding off neocolonial threats. So he said a shift in consciousness, quote, a new humanism was required. The third world, he said, must reject the values of colonialism. He spoke with that language. While colonialism valorized, quote, a society of individuals where each person shuts himself up in his own subjectivity, Fanon wrote, human nature is actually intersubjective. In the very forms of collective organizing that were necessary for anti-colonial struggle, colonized people recovered the kinship and solidarities that were integral to being human. Freedom was this, quote, world of reciprocal recognitions. So Fanon also understood liberation in the sense of a recovery of our full humanity as something that was experienced in the course of collective struggle. And this was a process, crucially, that needed to extend to the former colonizers. That's why his book, as you can see from this slide, was included a preface by Jean-Paul Sartre, who addressed his fellow Frenchmen in the preface saying, let's take a good look at ourselves if we have the courage, and let's see what has become of us. He's speaking as a Frenchman. This concern with colonizers' humanity reminds us that no one actually benefits from brutality and exploitation, even when they might seem to benefit financially. That is why British colonialism was such a guilt-ridden enterprise, as I wrote about in my book, as I mentioned, Time's Monster. Responding to anti-colonial critiques and the destruction of World War II, many European thinkers did search for alternative values. In the British context, just for one example, perhaps the most famous was the New Left historian and activist E.P. Thompson, pictured here, who, in his research on the English working classes, tried to equate Englishness and English values with the collective classes of the English working class rather than the individualistic, materialist values of the British elite, right? So besides a shift in values, Fanon also called for what he called, quote, the redistribution of wealth. And he pointed to the example of German reparations to victims of the Nazi regime. That was his moment. He wrote, the wealth of the imperial countries is our wealth too. Rather than spending money on nuclearizing the world, he said Europe must aid newly decolonized countries. But the shift in consciousness that he had called for, that was necessary for such a step, remained elusive in the context of Cold War neocolonialism. Leaders of newly free countries put forward alternative visions and calls for reparations. Their ideas about land redistribution, for instance, really robustly challenged neoliberal policies that put farmers in formerly colonized countries in further debt to the wealthier countries. But British elites, who still had a lot of power in this time and were afraid of the ascent of these collective values, which were also evident in the new welfare state in Britain itself, pushed back very hard on these new ideas. And I want to mention specifically here the founding in 1955 by these elites of a think tank, a neoliberal think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs. It was established specifically to counter ideas like land redistribution, and it did so with pseudo-academic research that was based on very selective use of data. So we'll come back to the IEA. But basically, it's a propaganda outfit, right? And with this propaganda, modernization theory prevailed over the land redistribution idea. So in India, for instance, desperate to ward off neocolonialism, India's leaders resorted to industrial catch-up instead of focusing on the farming sector and small farms and so on. And in that, they sort of adopted colonialism's material measure of civilization. And so here we have Nehru at a steel plant. Still in the 1970s, leaders of, I mean, it wasn't game over yet. In the 1970s, leaders of many former colonies proposed a new, what they called with capital letters, the new international economic order, the NIEO. They proposed this at the UN, and it was discussed, but the United States, of course, rejected this proposal. And then the ascent of neoliberalism with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, coupled with the erosion of the UN's power, sort of sealed the fate of that proposal. But awareness of the colonial drain did not go away. That state remained alive even in the West. Independency theories that were taught in political science and in economics. It was there in history departments, in post-colonial studies. It was there through the persistent demands for reparation, such as the Africa reparations movement of the 1990s. And in 1999, mainstream economic historians in Britain recognized that imperialism drove British development. This was not a woke idea. There was nothing crazy. These were very middle, politically mainstream British economic historians. 1999. 21st century scholars then went on to make it even more clear how what we now call ghost acreage that was acquired through slavery and colonialism drove Western prosperity. Economists went on to substantiate colonialism's role in British prosperity and in the prosperity of all the world's wealthy nations. A couple of examples, the sociologist Gurminder Bhamra in Britain at Sussex showed how colonial taxes actually funded Britain's welfare state, and she endorsed the need for, quote, justice through material reparations. This scholarship, this 21st century scholarship, was emerging against the backdrop of these revived popular movements for reparations that were invigorated by from 2015 by stuff that happened here, by the Rhodes Must Fall movement and by the, as Dilip was mentioning, the speech by the Indian politician Shashi Tharoor, his Oxford Union speech, where he brought up reparations, and then even more so in 2020 by the strengthening of the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd in the United States. As climate crisis also raised the practical stakes of the reparations question, this is Pakistan in 2022. We've had another series of floods this year, as intense in Punjab, in Pakistan and India. This climate crisis news also stoked awareness that the past, this colonial past, is not safely in the past. Some institutions did make apologies, restitution, there were commitments to equity, but there was also severe backlash, including denial that colonialism was expropriatory at all, and that its expropriatory nature is well established. And this backlash has really intensified, we see in the United States right now. Now, this backlash testifies to the enduring need for a shift in consciousness. Indeed, the preoccupation in this debate on the precise value, the number, right, the value of the reparations that are going to be paid, reveals the extent to which colonialism's kind of concepts and values continue to shape our present. So let me walk you through what I mean here. So in 2015, in his Oxford Union speech, Shashi Tharoor cited the figure of $3 trillion due to India from Britain that had been put forward by this Indian journalist named Minhas Merchant. But he said that this value, this sum, $3 trillion, is too high to be practically repaid. And that's why he called instead for, quote, symbolic reparation of £1 a year for 200 years, because the point was atonement, not cash. And now in 2018, using tax and trade data, The Economist, your wonderful introduction helped set this up for me. Thank you. This economist, Utsa Patnaik, pegged the drain, where am I on here? sorry, no, I'm still here. Pegged the drain of Indian wealth between 1765 and 1938 at an even higher figure of $45 trillion, still excluding a number of things such as wartime spending in World War II and so on. In 2021, she revised this estimate upwards to nearly $65 trillion for the period 1765 to 1900 cumulated to 2020, with the caution that this was still not a full measure of accounts. Now, the practical worry that paying reparations is going to ruin Britain financially, which is what's fueling the backlash, this worry surfaces so kind of reflexively that people actually have totally missed the point of the figures that Utsa Patnaik and Shashi Tharoor put on the table. Their point was precisely that these figures are so high, it is not practical for Britain to actually return the money that it drained from India. This is what Patnaik states very clearly in the writings where she presents these figures. She also affirms that though Britain, quote, morally owes reparations for the 3 million killed in the Bengal famine of 1943, nothing can compensate for that loss of lives. This is what she's saying. She's saying that it's impossible, right? To be sure, she does argue that because the, quote, entire industrializing world thrived on this drain, it does make sense for the industrial nations as a whole to repay the transfers, okay? But her stated scholarly priority is simply to ensure that conversations about reparations begin with what she calls the real history of empire. So she offers these figures as an estimate, not of reparations due, not of what needs to be paid, but of what has been lost as a foundation for any conversation about reparations. Now, despite the explicitly rhetorical function of the figures she put forward, even a journalist as persuaded of Britain's imperial legacies as Satnam Sanghera, I'm off here, argues, quote, that colossal numbers like Utsa Patnaik's stop being useful and reveal that both the left and the right are susceptible to, quote, excess when it comes to imperial history. But these kinds of figures are not a mark of excess. They are a mark of an effort, Utsa Patnaik's effort, economists' effort, to express historical tragedy in the quantitative language that we value, that we fetishize even. From a similar impulse, even scholars who acknowledge that not all of colonialism's impact can be measured in quantitative terms, even such scholars fair-mindedly concede to the right or to conservatives that it is impossible to resolve debates about the past satisfactorily in the absence of data. This fetish for numbers emerges from a failure to understand the past on its own terms, to understand that our categories of economic measurement, things like trade and GDP and capital investment, these are not descriptions of timelessly real objects. We don't have national accounting figures for 18th century India or 19th century Ghana because such figures could not have existed. And even if they did, they would not capture the full story because there is no way to measure quantitatively what was lost in the revolutionary transformation of people and every aspect of nature into countable, interchangeable commodities. There's no way to reckon quantitatively what was lost in the profaning of all that was holy, right? To put it in Marxist terms. This is why Fanon said decolonization means turning what colonialism had made a thing back into a man, right? So no amount of money can redeem colonialism because the true costs of the drain are incalculable. We can't show the counterfactual India in which wealth would have been invested differently over these centuries. Moreover, accounts will never actually be closed because the effects continue to compound, as we see with the climate crisis. The damage is sweeping and profound, bringing us all to existential crisis in the form of climate change. The recourse to accounting methods to assess empire's effects is rooted in a colonial-era rhetorical strategy of justifying British imperialism by tallying its harms against its positive effects, the pros and cons, right? Though the positives were seldom clear positives, and their enumeration rested on the racist presumption that brown and black people would not have progressed on their own, would not have made railways on their own, and so on. Accounting quantitatively for colonialism's damage has the effect of measuring colonialism in terms of its own primary value of material wealth, when in fact, as we know, and as Patnaik's colossal sums dramatize, the damages were social, cultural, psychological, and political. I mean, and a lot of this is the work that your dear friend, Professor Satadru Sen, was on all these aspects, like looking at childhood, looking at imprisonment and topics like this. So the damage was in all these categories, besides also the economic. Despite the financial benefits that they accrued, even Indian elites who collaborated with the colonial regime suffered from the loss of substantive political control, cultural autonomy, security, and so on. Likewise, Britons who benefited economically from slavery and imperialism, but they did so at major cultural, social, and moral cost. W.E.B. Du Bois, Gandhi, Fanon, many other thinkers of this time pointed that out in that era. But the shift in consciousness that they called for remained so elusive that even Utsa Patnaik cannot conceive of an alternative vision of modernity. She argues that without the drain, India might have, quote, imported technology to build up modern industrial structure much earlier than Japan. We would have built the Indian railways several times over. So now I want to shift to another example of how the stickiness of colonial values causes even well-meaning scholars to subvert calls for reparative action. So last May, Britain's conservative business and trade secretary, Kemi Badenoch, cited a booklet that was written by the head of political economy at the very same IEA, that Institute of Economic Affairs, to sort of support her defense of the imperial past. Now, this booklet claims, pretending as if, wide and deep scholarship on this question does not already exist, it claims that slavery and colonialism did not drive British economic growth. Kemi Badenoch referenced this book to deny the justice of demands for reparations and to hold up the West as a template for developing nations that were seeking prosperity. The launch of this booklet and Badenoch's speech making these points were remarkably synchronized. So such ideologically driven works that are written by individuals who have some kind of academic credential, but they don't have actual expertise in the topic that they're writing on, these kinds of works exist only by their willful, they just neglect the scholarship that already exists to disprove the points that they're making. And the historian Alan Lester published a masterful analysis of this booklet and its abuse of evidence. And I have said more in an essay that came out earlier this year in the Journal of British Studies, if you're interested. But meanwhile, an important book in favor of reparations wound up serving this IEA stance. Strange outcome. This was a book by Maxine Berg and Pat Hudson. That synthesizes a vast scholarship that exists that proves that slavery significantly shaped the British economy. But as I explain in my essay, the book at once sort of draws a veil around the scholarship that it's depending on by claiming to single-handedly be rescuing the marginalized work of Eric Williams, the Trinidadian historian and prime minister who wrote Capitalism and Slavery in 1944. Okay, so in fact, as the footnotes in Berg and Hudson's book shows, generations of scholars have kept Eric Williams' work and other works on slavery's role in British growth relevant for a long time. Hence the familiar textbook descriptions of what is known as the triangular trade. This is from Britannica Kids. This is how common this is. Slavery has certainly been marginalized in the mainstream story of Britain's past, as Berg and Hudson write, but its role in the Industrial Revolution is well established among scholars. They are not the first to make this clear. Now, despite claiming that most historians neglect this reality, Burke and Hudson still caution at the beginning of their book, quote, "We do not argue that slavery caused the Industrial Revolution. We do not argue that that slavery was necessary for the development of industrial capitalism in Britain." These opening disclaimers are entirely at odds with the book's evidence. Burke and Hudson write, for instance, that these are quotes from the book, Britain's textile revolution would not have occurred without Atlantic raw materials. British industry relied on products extracted with racially based coerced labor. The last page proclaims, quote, "Slavery was one of the sparks that set the Industrial Revolution alight." This is a clear causal statement that leaves space for other causal factors, but it is incompatible with the opening denial of slavery's causal role. Okay, now in a review of this book, Mark Harvey and Nicholas Draper have noted that despite the disclaimer about the necessary connection, Burke and Hudson's book argues exactly that. But these two reviewers also affirm that, quote, "No one argues that slavery caused the Industrial Revolution." They even say that Eric Williams never argues this, that Eric Williams insisted that triangular trade was not solely and entirely responsible for the Industrial Revolution. The journalist Will Hutton, responding to Kemi Badenoch's speech that drew on that IEA notebook, he brings up this Burke and Hudson book, which had come out just then. And he said that this book puts slavery at the heart of industrialization, whatever that means. But then he adds, quote, "No one argues that slavery caused the Industrial Revolution." Yeah. Such protests mistake commonsensical limits on statements of historical causality for the absence of any causal relationship. Yes, Eric Williams recognized that slavery on its own did not cause the Industrial Revolution. He said England's internal market and the plowing in of industrial profits also mattered. But his arguments that profits from slavery were invested in British industry, that West Africa and the Caribbean provided markets for British manufacturers, and that British industries emerged specifically to process tropical products from the Caribbean, absolutely recognize slavery's causal role in the Industrial Revolution as it actually unfolded. So let's pause for a second. What is the job of a historian? It's to help humans make cognitive sense of existence by giving the vicissitudes of time a narrative structure, an account that explains how a series of events came to pass, some causal explanation. A genealogical relationship between a later and earlier event that we perceive only retrospectively is not causal in the sense of being linked by the laws of history. There are no such laws. Prior events do not predestine later events. History is contingent. So that means that historians' decisions about how they write history ultimately represents a moral choice. It's again, we're back at the question of values, right? So the knowledge that there were many causes, this is another example, the knowledge that we know that there were many causes of World War I, right? But this doesn't stop us from acknowledging that national rivalries were one cause, right? The reluctance in scholarship on slavery and industrialization to make that causal statement emerges, I think, from a perceived need for protection against the political consequences of a causal claim at the expense of scholarly clarity. It is also rooted in an attachment to a colonial era view of history as governed by laws. Burke and Hudson embrace such a view in seeing industrial revolution as a necessary phase in a universal trajectory of economic progress that would have happened even without slavery. While acknowledging the horrors that enabled the British Industrial Revolution, they don't question the Industrial Revolution's overall benefit to, quote, the wider economy. Even despite recognizing that, quote, racially based coerced labor continued to drive industrialism in Britain even after abolition, and even though they recognize that environmental destruction has been a, quote, recurrent and present feature of global capitalism. They assemble a more inclusive picture of the creation of the great collections that underpin Europe's knowledge of the natural world, highlighting that enslaved people and indigenous people assisted British explorers, but they don't question this touchstone of triumphalist accounts of the West to consider, for instance, the loss of great indigenous knowledge cultures, which climate experts today are now trying to recover as models of sustaining ecological practice. Now, in denying colonialism and slavery's role in British growth, the IEA booklet smartly quoted Berg and Hudson's opening disclaimer of a causal or necessary connection. So they use that as support to deny, right, this connection. The author of this booklet also made use of Berg and Hudson's insistence that theirs is, quote, not the mainstream view in the field, that they are kind of reintroducing Eric Williams to the world, and their claim that their book is a heterodox challenge to the status quo rather than the confirmation of a consensus. Do you see how they sort of dug the grave of their own contribution? Berg and Hudson's pretense at single-handedly reviving a forgotten Williams thesis thus empowered right-wing political crusaders to paint arguments about Britain's debts to colonialism as fringy, rather than as long established by generations of scholars. In fact, as Will Hutton noted in his article, the IEA position is the one that is, quote, a risible recasting of history. In my essay that I showed you, I discuss other recent historical works aimed at popular audiences in which prominent Western scholars' moral choices in their framing and their writing has helped create space for politically motivated denialism of the facts of imperial history. These choices reflect enduring attachment to the colonial era social science models and assumptions that scholars like Patnaik and Bhamra are warning us against. Leaving aside the obvious racial divide in this scholarship, the prima facie refusal to take arguments about slavery and empire's causal role in British economic prosperity seriously, the kind of proleptic delegitimization of such arguments is clear. In my essay, I focus on the takeaways for historians for how we write, where we kind of individualistically might exaggerate the novelty of our contributions and extend the life of colonial era social science concepts and rhetorical habits. But here in this talk, I'm highlighting these pitfalls which compromise even work like Berg and Hudson's that's aimed at forwarding the cause of reparations and reckoning with the past as evidence of the urgent need for that shift in consciousness. That shift obviously requires educational change, as anti-colonial activists recognized, and their movements included a lot of educational experiments on the understanding that colonial education perpetuated colonial values. Shashi Tharoor also asked for a commitment to changing British curriculum so that school children would learn what Britain owes former colonies. And there have been some heartening changes in the UK of late, and it's possible that coming generations may think differently from those whose nostalgia about empire kind of fed the Brexit movement. But it's not just the content, but the values behind education that need shifting, as evident from the obvious lack of moral courage among American university leaders today. In the face of climate crisis, today's philosophers are also calling for a shift in consciousness toward recognizing the mutual dependence of Earth's beings. Colonial era political economy's assumptions about a kind of selfish, morbidly individualistic human nature are merely assumptions, Amitav Ghosh reminds us. To give one example, history is, he says, littered with empirical evidence of our essentially empathetic and cooperative nature. So where does all this leave the practical question of reparations? There is precedent. Governments have long paid compensation for loss of property and life, including infamously the massive reparations that were paid to slave owners after abolition. There was even a single instance of compensation to Indian subjects after the 1919 Amritsar massacre, but the government at the time was adamant that the meager payments should not set a precedent. That was part of the plan. More recently, survivors of British concentration camps in Kenya have successfully sued for compensation. And Aboriginal Australians have won the right to sue for colonial land loss. Queen Elizabeth's 1995 apology in New Zealand enabled the return of a fraction, at least, of land that was stolen from the Maori. But there are also seemingly paralyzing practical questions. Should reparations for slavery be paid to the West African governments in the regions that enslaved people were taken from, or should they be paid to descendants of former slaves wherever they are? What about the descendants then of indentured laborers? Should they get reparations? And the descendants of colonial subjects who suffered through famine, or immigrants who came to Britain as needed workers and then suffered racist attack? And how much can be paid without crippling the British economy? And should individuals or collectives or the state or private institutions be paying these reparations? There's also the ethical objection that it isn't just for Britain's society today, including immigrants who weren't there at the time, to pay for the crimes of previous generations. And there are persuasive practical answers to this objection, such as the need to compensate for undeserved inheritance of wealth and privilege, access to education, employment, and so on, however innocently it was acquired. And everyone is accountable in Britain for the apathy that allowed myths about Britain's past to thrive and harm specific communities. But a shift in consciousness actually gets us past all such practical confusions and questions. The obstacle is actually more imaginative than practical. Once we consider the question from a starting point of our mutual interdependence, from those values, the need to act today in support of those bearing the brunt of climate crisis is obvious and simple, regardless of the past, even though, of course, we know that the crisis is here because of the very same past. So what I'm saying is, even if no debt were owed, the ethical response to human suffering is to help, because we lose our own humanity if we do not. In short, the fact that the transfers from wealthy nations that are needed to address climate crisis are also historically justified is incidental to the fact that they are ethically required in the present, according to the transcendent human values and experience of freedom that colonialism suppressed. So if wealth redistribution is needed, so be it, and it needn't wait on accurate measure of a historical drain that is anyway beyond quantitative capture. Don't laugh, I'm going to talk about a cartoon now. The 2019 Disney, or laugh, it's fine. The 2019 Disney movie Frozen 2 similarly frames reparations as an extension of values that make sense to children. As the people of Arundel, I don't know how many of you have seen this movie? Anybody? All of you, okay. Maybe, yeah, you've probably already found this connection. People of Arundel become climate refugees, and Queen Elsa and Princess Anna discover the suppressed truth about Arundel's dominance of Northuldra through this dam. And they're certain that there's no way forward without atonement. So Anna destroys the dam, though she knows there's a risk that this is going to flood her country of Arundel. But the reason she does this is she understands that Arundel is not going to prosper even if she doesn't take this risky step, because of the way the past is continually erupting into the present. Moreover, the long suffering of the people of Northuldra was equally undeserved. And if the people of Arundel go on ignoring that, they are going to lose their humanity anyway. So these are the values of reparation. Once we overcome fear of the practical loss that a particular value of reparation might entail, the values of reparation can actually kind of save everyone. Commitment to energy-intensive, individualistic, consumption-based development has entailed enslavement, displacement, and alienation, and brought us to a planetary collapse that forces us to recover at last from a mindset that anti-colonial leaders warned long ago had to go. It's a way of life that is not good for us, even if the climate were not at stake. It's worth imagining what Britain would be like today if its government had apologized for the violence, loot, and racism of empire. What sort of moral capital might such a Britain have accrued by now? For Fanon, decolonization depended on renewing national culture by constructing a new future together, replacing folklore with the whole body of what he called, quote, the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence. This would take national consciousness toward political and social consciousness to transnational consciousness. British backlash against reparations, which is expressed through this hysterical defense of heritage, is tied up with the crisis of British identity that is evident in both Brexit and the regional separatist movements. There's a need, in short, to renew national consciousness in Britain. Just as in World War II, when George Orwell urged his fellow Britons to commit to revolutionary social change because, quote, we must add to our heritage or lose it. In the end, British conversations about statues, reparations, artifacts, and apologies are reparatory, regardless of what they actually achieve. Knowledge of Britain's colonial past was deliberately excised from British education, so dialogue is better than the silence of erasure. It makes new history possible by putting the past on the table, cultivating historical awareness that has the potential to shift consciousness and Britishness. It also renews the long tradition of British dissent about empire, including criticism of figures like Cecil Rhodes in his own time. Empire has been integral to human history, but we have only once now been on the brink of environmental collapse. Modern European imperialism was in this way a unique formation predicated on material measures of progress, exclusive territorial control, racial hierarchy, and homogenization. And I describe these qualities that set modern empire apart in this essay and scroll if you're interested. This is an Indian ezine. And these qualities led to this unique historical moment, and they require then unique measures of reparation for new futures to become possible. This is not to say that Europeans are especially bad, but to identify the origins of values that have not served any of us, and to urge redistribution of financial, moral, and cultural capital so that we might all recommit to values based on our intersubjective cooperative nature going forward. All religious traditions discourage a culture of accumulation. Unapologetic embrace of accumulation in the modern era flew in the face of millennia of moral thought about how to relate to other beings and the earth, which had evolved in support of our species' survival. Reparations cannot undo the past or fully compensate for past injustices, but they are a chance to re-anchor human existence in mutual values. And I just want to close, because of where we are, with this picture. Gandhi was a lawyer who trained in London, in Britain, right, and practiced here in South Africa. But his practice morphed into an effort to foster, he sort of stopped being a lawyer and worked on private compromises to end conflicts, because he became very critical of the way that lawyers sacrifice truth for financial gain and thus kind of enabled the violence of the police and jailers. In 1910, he abandoned the law altogether and focused on satyagraha, meaning insistence on truth, including breaking unjust laws. So the opposite of being a lawyer. And I think each of us as students and scholars in institutions, from that era, I'm at Stanford, founded by Robert Barron, and, here we are in South Africa at WITS. Each of us as students and scholars in this very tumultuous time must contend with what kind of student and scholar we want to be, our relationship to these institutions, and what values will let us be that kind of student or scholar. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
Just say a few words, then
Sure. Should I sit there or should I? I'll stand here.
take
Okay.
a look.
Okay, I'll have some water.
So thank you very much, Priya, for that broad landscape that you provided to think the question of reparations with. And when you brought up Frozen, I thought you were going to end with the message, let it go. But but obviously that's not the that's not the direction your talk took. I was just thinking that about the question of reparations. The one quote that comes to mind is one that has now been made very popular by social media, Faulkner's observation, Requiem for a Nun, where he says the past is never dead, it is not even past. And I think that really is the question that we are engaging with. And and particularly with regard to the connection between slavery and capitalism, is there a link that is well defined and can be proved, Or is this something that allows for more political arguments to be made? Eric Williams was very wry about all of this. See, the way the British go on about the abolition of slavery, you'd think they invented it for the sheer pleasure of abolishing it, right? So there's a whole question of slavery and capitalism, which still remains an open-ended issue. There are three things that I'd like to, more in the nature of comments rather than questions. This whole calculation of financial cost, and as you say, this is more symbolic than anything else. It's not as if Utsa Patnaik is saying return 65 trillion to us. And this is something that's quite evident in the book and the argument that she's making. And so for a lot of economists who have ridden this bandwagon of the question of financial reparations, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde, economists are people who know the price of everything but the value of nothing. So he said it's of cynics. So what is the true cost? This is the question that you're asking. What is the true cost and what reparation can be made for the true cost of colonialism and imperial rule? And if we read Ngugi, right, and Ngugi spoke about the sheer devastation of being. We speak in a language that is not our own, invoking a history that is not our own, with concepts that are not our own. And that is the situation in which we are trying to rethink the past. And what is the price that we have paid? The second comment that I have to make is the whole argument about the ethical reconstitution of self. That is the lesson to be learned from colonialism. Colonialism is over. There are ways in which we have been refashioned and warped by colonialism, and now we need to reconstitute ourselves. And Gandhi makes his argument, Fanon makes his argument. But within the Gandhian frame, I wonder what the limits of the argument for reparations can be as well, because for him, a request for reparations would necessarily involve an element of coercion and therefore of violence. Because Gandhi always argued that there must be a change of heart, right? So even with the question of caste, he was determined that the upper caste needed to have a change of heart. They couldn't be forced into rejecting this violent hierarchy that was caste. So does invoking Gandhi help? And that's because very often we return to Gandhi as some kind of post-colonial thinker. And for me, Gandhi has lost his value as a post-colonial thinker because of the multiple contradictions and fearfulness and belief in hierarchy that he continued to hold on to till the very end of his life. But that's another question. The third point is, I think, something that is more it's very personal, and it's a question that as post-colonial people, as post-colonial humans, we are probably truly concerned with, that we are very aware that much of what we are has not been shaped only by colonialism. That many of the inequities that we live with in the present as individual acts and as social constitution are something that we have made for ourselves. The evil in our society is really us. And when we think about that, then we're reminded of Benjamin's statement in the philosophy of history that it's only for a redeemed humanity that a past is citable in all its movements. And regardless of whether we are colonials or post-colonial, I think that question hangs over us. And this question of ethical reconstitution of self remains a question. But what you've suggested is something that I think offers a pragmatic solution. And by pragmatic solution, I don't mean to undercut the argument in any way, that we need to think with the present and the ethical response to the crisis that is before us, whether it is of the environment or of man's inhumanity to man. And so I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks which kind of helped frame a whole set of issues about the value of reparations. And so now we're open to questions. And what we'll do is request people who are online and people in the audience. So may I take questions from the audience who are present here, and then I'll move online. And we have around 15 to 20 minutes, so that it's not a substantial amount of time, but I think that will allow us to engage. So if there are any questions in the audience, Priya?
Follow to what you said.
Of course, yeah. Do you want to do that as part? We'll ask.
Sure.
Yeah, unless you think you might forget what I said. Which,
Yeah,
I know they're eminently forgettable remarks. So.
I'll get my
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
Do you want to come here? Yeah, because then the.
Oh, yeah, because it'll be on the Zoom. Okay. Yeah, no, I wrestle with some of the questions you brought up too, and so I just wanted to share in case it's helpful this issue about Gandhi, for instance, and it's as you said, he was still invested in forms of hierarchy. What I find still valuable, why I still think he's relevant, is that he was so self-consciously always trying to get to the point of having decolonized himself. He was very aware that this is something that needs to be done to the self. And the fact that he didn't get there is less important to me than the fact that he was sort of modeling that this is something that has to be done. And there are ways in which, as a collective, we need to struggle through things, but that requires work to be done, on the level of the self. Fanon is a psychiatrist. He's literally thinking about, the mind of an individual, even though he recognizes we're intersubjective beings. And so I don't think Gandhi loses his relevance by the fact that he never arrived at sort of exactly our ideas of, how to do away with hierarchy and really see everyone as equals, as brothers and sisters. I think that, the name of his book, My Experiments with Truth. He's experimenting, and he's always, always, always in dialogue, and very willing to be in open public dialogue and receive the pushback and answer. And I find that makes him extremely useful, just in terms of the kind of unending process of self-questioning that is required of each of us. And I think that is connected to your other point, where you're sort of reminding us that all the evil we do is not brought on by colonialism, it's in us. But I think two things there. One is this is why, so they're connected. One is that obviously greed has always existed and always been a problem, right? But what changes with some of the ideas that came with, I'm going to talk about British colonialism, is this idea that they're sometimes necessary evils, right? This is like crack cocaine, right? This is like, now I can do greed and I can actually think that I'm doing good because it's going to do good in the end. That option wasn't available before. It's like, greed is bad, and yeah, I'm being shameful, and I hope no one finds out I'm a greedy, and maybe I'll go to hell in the afterlife. But there's no pretense that I'm actually doing good for anyone but myself. This is something new, I think, and it makes it a lot easier for a lot more people to be a lot worse. And that's why I think when someone like Iqbal comes back and says no, or even, Butterfield, the British historian, who he's a very devout Christian, and Herbert Butterfield, he says he criticizes the same necessary evil concept, and he, like, almost exactly in the same words as Iqbal says, no, the real purpose of history is for each of us. We are our own purpose of history. So it is that the evil is within us. That's why when you're on this earth, you're supposed to be doing the kind of thing we saw Gandhi doing, which is like remaking yourself. And it's not a process where you're never going to be perfect, because you're always going to be human, and we're stuck in the human condition. But I just wanted to respond. That's how I worked it out for myself. But yeah, questions.
Thank you very much. I think it's an insightful delivery offering to consider reparations and how sometimes the quantifying of how much reparations are needed for a particular community are required. It's almost something that is impossible.
Yeah.
We are speaking about something that happens over generations.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy prescriptive practice that can be done. But sometimes I wonder, and I'm not by any way a historian, so this is a provocation for you, that maybe you can also assist me in terms of the questions that I have in my mind. But sometimes I wonder that even when, like Prof was saying, there isn't a change of heart. So when decolonization happens, there is still that micromanaging that happens, because when at the heart of these liberation movements is the ownership of strategic means of production, and which eventually will lead to self-determination and so on and so forth. And through self-determination, maybe the self will then emerge, because suddenly you have a sense of ontology to the world. Now I wonder if the very same structures intervene. Assassinations of Patrice Lumumba, assassination of all these liberation icons, that perhaps it's not really about the money that is needed to quantify, but just to pull back and let people, self-determine for themselves.
You mean at least do no
Sorry.
more harm?
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, I have to come back to something.
Could you just
At least do no more harm. At least stop the neocolonialism.
could you just reframe his question? They would not have heard it.
Oh, okay.
And
The question was, when perhaps even aside from paying anything in terms of reparations, if those acts of sort of political assassination and trying to control the political affairs in what we thought were decolonized countries, if that would stop, that in itself would be, yes, that's why I think I think even at the beginning we were saying, that's why the past is not really past, that's it. We are not in a actually post-colonial era. It is that we are in a colonialism reinventing itself. My first book had that phrase covert empire. And I think once you get into the Cold War era and the United States is the big global superpower, that's the US kind of way of doing empire, is through assassinations, CIA actions, whether in Iran, you can think of any number of places, Afghanistan, so on. That it's an ongoing way of asserting control, but it comes out of a particular set of values. It, for me, is just testimony to the fact that we didn't really have, we had sort of the illusion of decolonization, like almost like a mirage or something. But that reckoning that Sartre called for among the French, for instance, it happened maybe more in France, I think. The government fell and the next republic came, right? But I don't think in the US and in the UK, that kind of reflection has happened.
Rahul,
Yeah.
you have a question?
Yes. I think it's quite wonderful to think about reparations in this way. So thank you, as a change in consciousness. But yet it seems to be that reparations is still then premised on the past being in the past and reparations
Exactly.
later.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, does there need to be a shift of consciousness in reparations itself, such that we are capable of thinking about reparations for the present? Or is that just an entirely different question, or a different term? And as an example, I got asked, how do you see an end to what is happening in Palestine? The genocide, the ecocide, etc. And I couldn't quite see what that end would be, but it seems that reparations could be possible once it has ended, whatever that may look like. But in the present, I don't know if I'm articulating as well.
No, I know what you mean. So first of all, I want to clarify that I actually agree with the first question you laid out, that reparations, the kind of presumption that something happened before that we just need to tie up the loose ends or something. I think that's not the best way to think about this. That's why I said I actually think that the past is kind of a red herring in the whole reparations debate. We know why climate crises are having much worse effect and damage in a place like Pakistan than they have serious damage in Britain too. Like there were a couple winters ago, there was no heat in Britain in the, serious problems happened, but not what we're seeing in Punjab, and so we know that the cause is that colonial past and the kind of permanent infrastructures it left behind and way of thinking and state structures and all of that. We know that. But what I'm saying is it really doesn't matter regardless, even if we didn't know that, if we're going to be the kind of people that, if we're going to be decolonized people, if we want to actually be post-colonial people, then when you see a climate crisis among your fellow humans, wherever it is in the world, and you have some resources, even if you don't fully have resources, you should still do something, right? I mean, there's this case when the Irish famine happened, in the 1840s, the Choctaw Nation in the United States, who had been displaced from the South for the cotton plantations and wound up in like Oklahoma and that area, they sent money to Ireland as like we know, in brotherhood. And to this day, there is like this Irish Choctaw connection. And it's not that the Choctaw had a lot of resources to share. It was more just out of a sense of like, you are our fellow beings, you're going through something, we know what that is. It's just being human. It's just the decent thing to do. That's different values, they didn't look back and say, wait, do we owe the Irish money or not? Well, the Irish came too, they were bad settlers. That wasn't part of the calculation. That's something the past is a red herring. What is the morally or ethically, what are we ethically obligated to do if the purpose of our being on earth is making sure that we are remaking ourselves ethically, right? That is what we're supposed to be doing, I think, but yeah.
Let's check if there are any questions in the chat box. Maybe we could have questions from those online. You could just
there's a raised hand.
There's Geeta Patel. So Geeta, could you just unmute yourself and ask the question?
Or have we muted her?
Sure, I'm actually unmuted. Thank you for an absolutely fantastic talk. In fact, I sent it out to lots of people who are working on reparations.
Oh, wow, thank you.
Yes. So I'm hoping this will be on, this will be a recording that's available, because I know a lot of people who actually literally are actually writing papers in law and finance. But I want to go a completely different direction because you provoked something for me. And we have a very quotidian technology of payment for loss, where the past is given value in the present, which is insurance, right? And the reason I'm just wondering, and I've been struggling, in fact, myself, with actually trying to figure out how the technologies of insurance work with questions of reparation. And, sort of this is obviously, insurance is integral to the sort of constant consolidation of capitalism. But one of the things that's very interesting about insurance, which I thought was very important in what you laid out in your talk, is the relationship between values and value, right? And in a very particular way, which is when there's certain groups, it's like a red lined, what you call in the US, red line communities, like communities of color, when they actually claim insurance, it's constituted as a form of moral hazard on their part. So it's literally a claim that they will sort of move into forms of immoral claiming that will keep, quote unquote, bad behaviors continuing. And so the moral force of that claim actually forces, quote unquote, gets insurance companies to accept the fact and work with, I mean, literally accrue capital by refusing that claim.
Mm-hmm.
So the paradox is the moral hazard is not on the community that has been, that has paid in order to claim, but on the company. And I think the reason why I'm asking this is because in a lot of, in actually the ways in which reparations are sometimes addressed, and you know a lot more than I do, is the sort of, it's around moral claims and a refusal of moral claims and the sort of implicit moral hazard of allowing communities any form of reparations, even in the sense of, acknowledging the fact that reparations were necessary. Does that make sense? So I'm wondering if you've thought about, because you've sort of done so much work on them over the years, whether you've sort of looked at the way in which reparations, the way people talk about reparations in all of these very nuanced genres of speaking about them, if there's any sort of insidious appearance of insurance and the technologies of insurance in them.
Oh,
I mean, it's a complicated question, but
so you're asking if I've come across like insurance companies being like
no. So not literal insurance, because what you're asking us to do also is move away from simple literalism, right? But
okay.
insurance is something that is a practice that that all of us are engaged in, right? It's a commonplace practice for payment on loss, right? But it also has these other after effects, including things like moral hazard, right? So it's constituted as fiscal value, but in fact, in it is this notion of moral value. So I'm wondering if there's a kind of way in which insurance, the way people think insurance floats into, not literal insurance companies, but the way people think insurance floats into how
I
people think
haven't
of
seen that,
reparations.
but I do think the moral hazard question is often invoked as a excuse for not for unwillingness to pay reparations. Like, oh, we'll pay reparations to these corrupt third world governments, and it won't even reach the people who need it. And that kind of argument is made, as a kind of practical obstacle. We would pay, but what would be the point? It's better if we fund our NGOs who then go and, help the miserable people in the third world. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, and
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I wish we could take out insurance against being colonized. That
Oh,
would
completely. That would be fantastic. And neocolonialism.
yeah. Thank you, Geeta. Are there any more questions? Please raise your hand. If not, then perhaps you could end the session here. For those of you who are online and those of you who are not present, the recording will be up online on YouTube, like with all the other Satadru Sen Memorial lectures. All 6 of them are online, so will this be. And thank you, Ma. Thank you, Professor Korubi Sen, for continuing to endow this. We'll have the lecture again. We've been trying to hold the lecture on either October 2nd, which is Gandhi's birthday, or April 14th, which is Ambedkar's birthday. But then speakers' schedules have never allowed this. But I'm glad it's being held, nevertheless. And so thank you all for being here. Some of you are attending at a very late hour or at a very early hour. For us, the time is just perfect. We're all going off for dinner. So thank you. Good night. And a pleasure to have you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It was fabulous. Thank you.
How do you end the recording? There's a recording. So just do that.
That one.